Thank you very much for kindly organizing this wonderful lecture series, which is very timely, especially in the COVID world. In this COVID era, we have been looking for such online lectures, online presentations, online classrooms and all that. So this is a very wonderful initiative, and I congratulate the principal of Ramananda College. I also thank the members of the Department of English of Ramananda College for kindly organizing this lecture series. To talk about my area, my subject that I will shortly be dealing with, it's a really a vast subject, a challenging subject. And I believe that to study Milton is also to study the socio-political situations prevalent at the time. So that's why when we talk about Milton, when we talk about Paradise Lost, when we talk about his other poems like Samson Agonistes, Paradise Regained, Comus, etc., Lycidas, Il Penseroso, we always consider Milton as a poet. But Milton's personality is split into two different aspects. On the one hand, there is the political. On the other hand, there is the poetical. So it is sometimes very, very difficult to come to terms with these two standpoints of the poet, the political standpoint and the poetical standpoint. It is therefore, to begin with, it is therefore necessary to know extensively about the socio-political situation of that time. Milton is a unique poet who experienced three monarchs, the governance of three monarchs: James I, Charles I, and before that, sorry, James I, Charles I, and yes, Oliver Cromwell, briefly Richard Cromwell, and then Charles II. So this actually leads us to properly think about the socio-political situation of the time. And I will try to, very briefly, it's a very vast subject, but I will try to very briefly focus on the changes, on the governing situations of the time frame where Milton is present. He was born in 1608, we know. So therefore, let us try to think about the changes that were taking place at that time. First of all, I would say that Milton actually was passing through an age of turbulence. And there had been different kinds of changes. We know that the first definitive change was the opposition to the governing systems of philosophy. The axiomatic medieval scholastic philosophy canvassed by St. Augustine or the English philosopher Ramus, and they were gradually being replaced by new cultural and philosophical formations. And this transformation was, in fact, a gradual rejection of the earlier medieval epistemic authority. So nothing will be taken for granted. Up to the Elizabethan period, or up to the middle of the Elizabethan period, we find that there had been always an acceptance, a complete acceptance of the axiomatic abstraction enshrined in scholastic philosophy. But we gradually find that there had been questions. We'll come to that. Another major change had been the change from the Tudor to Stuart dynasty. After Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, James VI of Scotland and Wales became the King of England and the King of Scotland as James I, thus conceptualizing very distinctively the idea of Great Britain for the first time. But the Stuart court actually was marked by a distinctive change under James I. For instance, James's support to his favorites in terms of showering on them gifts, titles, honors was well known. And all at the cost of the public exchequer. He was doing this. Let me give you one or two instances. There was someone who actually joined James I as his personal page, and his name was Robert Carr, C-A-R-R, Robert Carr. And as James I liked him so much, he became the Viscount of Rochester in 1611, and then Earl of Rochester in 1613. And then after this, Robert Carr was replaced by George Villiers, who later became the Duke of Buckingham. At the same time, the Queen's taste for excessive expenditure on luxury and lavish entertainment was well known. This naturally brought about a distinctive change from the earlier dignity and gravity of the Elizabethan court. There's a gradual shift from the earlier grandeur, from the earlier dignity of the Elizabethan court. This excessive irregularity in expenditure definitely told on the economic progress of the country. Well, when we come to Charles I, we find that he wanted to somehow restrict this kind of inordinate excess. He wanted to bring about a sense of moderation and balance. Now, on its religious side, this is the third change. England's attempt to remove papal sovereignty. So it actually started from the time of Henry VIII, especially through the Act of Restraint of Appeals passed by the Parliament in 1553. What is this? Removal of papal sovereignty. It's actually a refusal to show allegiance to Roman Catholicism, Roman Catholic Church. This was further strengthened by especially the Archbishop of Canterbury. Archbishop of Canterbury actually used to play a very, very important role. The Bishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was particularly functional. He had as many as 4 distinctive functions. Number 1, he would abolish papal supremacy. Number 2, there should be public proclamation on the nature of the English Church, and the Archbishop should encourage the English language Bible and the destruction of hundreds of Catholic monasteries. James I was not an exception to this. He very definitely tried to stand against the opposition to stand against the episcopal polity. What is this episcopal polity? That means church governance by the bishops. This was actually a threat to the monarchy, because the monarchy wanted to set itself above the church governance. So that's why if they accept the authority of the episcopal governance, then where does monarchy stand? So this is how a kind of growing disturbance was underway. The Reformed Church was in favor of establishing a strictly Presbyterian system. That means a church governance led by the bishops, which was very popular in Scotland. The Reformed Church of Scotland sought to dismantle the hierarchical form of church governance. But James considered the hierarchical church, constituting of bishops and dioceses, as mutually inclined to sustenance of monarchy. So there was a settlement. And moreover, there was a gunpowder plot, which, took place in 1605. And that created a huge uproar. And there was an open announcement that the gunpowder plot was actually a trap for the destruction of monarchy. And it was also held that the Catholic Church was behind this. So there had been, again, another form of disturbance. Let me just refer to another point. So we find that this kind of disturbance, controversy was going on throughout the reign of James I. But from the very beginning of Charles I's reign, severe problems and issues began to loom large in the horizon. There were as many as 5 distinctive problems during the reign of Charles I. Number 1, the decline of economy. Number 2, the falling scale of trade and fiscal policy, the taxations. The disastrous outbreak of plague, the continuing price rise, and conflicting relationship with the parliament. So there have been many such problems coming up, especially the expenditure of the king. The expenditure, the debate developed between the debate that developed between the church and the parliament, between the king and the parliament, was initiated by Charles I forced loans to the amount of 2,060,000 as collection of loans. And he did this without the approval of the parliament. And this escalated the growing sense of anger and dismay among the people. The king's indiscriminate use of his powers raised controversies, and the Commons proposed to cut down the tonnage and poundage. These were the customs. And this was granted to the king from medieval times. But the House of Commons, for the first time, cut down the tonnage and poundage system. This further aggravated the situation. The contentious relation between the House of Commons and the king reached such a height that Charles I even imprisoned some members of the Commons. In the session of the Parliament of 1628-29, the Commons announced the Petition of Rights. In 1629, they published the Petition of Rights, thereby trying to stabilize the powers of the Parliament, but to no effect. Moreover, the war with France and Spain proved fortuitous. The Duke of Buckingham, who led the attack, was a dismal failure, and there was an open public resentment. After the assassination of Buckingham in 1628, the king became sad and aggrieved, while the public had been rejoicing at Buckingham's assassination. In the wake of this escalating confrontation between the king and the parliament, Charles finally dismissed the parliament in 1629 and continued his personal rule for the next 11 years. This was unprecedented. But Charles I should not necessarily be imaged as always in the negative light. He also was trying to do certain things which were very important. Number 1, this was the king, here was the king who always used to personally read all official papers and documents before arriving at a decision. Pauline Gregg wrote a book called History of Charles I. There she says, on the basis of the documents that she had examined, she says he would sign a wide range of documents of varying importance which came to him from his Secretary of State alone. He was sufficiently conscientious to read them all, and many times attended them in his own fine, spidery handwriting, and sufficiently punctilious to dispense with a sign manually and actually to write his name on each of those papers that he approved. This shows that he was very, very punctual in reading out all the documents. And he also wanted to continue the policy reforms and try to take very appropriate measures. I'm not going into all the details because that will take much of our time before we come to Milton. In 1634, he took some fortuitous measures. Number one, he levied ship money tax. It was a medieval form of tax that used to be collected by the king from medieval times. It actually fomented a revolt among the taxpayers. And then, very importantly, the appointment of William Laud as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. I've just told you some moments back that the Archbishop of Canterbury used to play a very, very important role in church governance, and they had the power also to impact on the systems of monarchy. So the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury was very, very important, and William Laud was appointed to that position. But Laud's, L-A-U-D, Laud, William Laud. William Laud's religious practice was apparently anti-Calvinistic, and he also tried to propagate and stabilize Arminianism, another form of another sect of Christianity. The critics of Laud began to be openly flogged. I remember that there was a schoolmaster in Westminster School. He openly criticized William Laud's decisions. And that master of Westminster School was openly flogged in front of his pupils for making disparaging remarks. So therefore, in this way, Laud's importance in the governance of Charles I's monarchical system actually went against the people's sentiments. And there had been also a deep grievance gradually brewing up among the Scots. Number one, after becoming the king, Charles I never really decided to visit Scotland at least once. And long after, he went to visit Scotland in 1633, and very briefly, and there was a distinctive clamor that the king has come here to take away the land that was given to the Scottish nobility free of cost. And at the same time, that the king had come to make the Scottish prayer book compatible with the English Book of Common Prayer, thereby trying to destroy the distinctive identity of the Scots. As a result, in 1640, the Scots invaded England. It's in this way that the king, in fact, was particularly functional in organizing a Puritan movement against himself. And this movement was joined by people of all kinds, people from all kinds of social strata. This was further conjoined with the opposition of Charles's implementation of Ship Money Act in 1640 without the approval of the Parliament. And it was meant to fund the personal expenses of Charles I. As there developed increasingly disputes, the king in 1637 obtained the ruling that the king should enjoy absolute authority in implementing taxes. The Parliament was reopened in 1640. All members assembled and submitted their grievances relating to religion, liberty of the Parliament, and the protection of property. It led to continuous disputes and contentions, and Charles once again dissolved the Parliament, and finally he strengthened a rebellion against monarchy that led to the Civil War. The Civil War led to the execution of Charles I and the formation of the Puritan Commonwealth under the Lord Protectorship held by Oliver Cromwell till his death in 1658, and later briefly by his son Richard Cromwell. But this period of interregnum gradually began to be shorn of the high hopes and enthusiasm that it portrayed. Gradually, it began to be questioned because no appropriate administrative procedure was formed and no lasting legislation was passed by the Parliament. It is true that the victories against the Scots, the Dutch, and the Irish helped it to emerge as a significant military power, but regicide conduced to hostility among the European powers. So therefore, we can see that during these 2 reigns, there have been a distinctive disturbance and turbulence, and Milton grew up to experience such turbulences. After Charles II's return, we find that it is called the Restoration period. Why Restoration? Number one, politically speaking, it was a restoration of monarchy. Number two, culturally speaking, it was a restoration of theatre houses and dramatic activity, which were shut down under the Puritan rule. Number three, it was a restoration of stability, balance, and order after a prolonged phase of disorder and turmoil. Actually, I will, in the next section, I will just talk about very briefly about the new philosophy and science. Actually, this particular period, despite such political and religious turmoils, is marked by the beginning of new philosophy and new science. If there had been no such ushering in of new philosophy and new science, there would have been no metaphysicals. There would have been no experimentations in the hands of Dryden and many others. Actually, it was as I said in the very beginning of this lecture, that there was a complete rejection of the absolute axiomatic authority of the principles of scholasticism. It is here that we find that there is a spirit of questioning. That's why this is the early modern period, which is regarded as Vicinator Novi Temporis, the herald of the new time. And it is the time which the French philosophers said, identified as la recherche de la vérité, the search for the truth. So that's why it is in this period that we find that from the very beginning there had been, different kinds of, controversies. There had been encouragement given to scientific experiment. For instance, Bacon, in his advancement of learning, began to challenge Aristotelianism, the long-standing citadel of authority, and stresses the importance of judgment. That's why in advancement of learning, he says, oportet edoctum judicare. meaning should be taught to judge, should be taught to judge rather than opported dicentem credere, to be taught to believe. We should not be taught to believe, we should be taught to judge. This is a very important statement that was made by Bacon in his Advancement of Learning, ushering in the age of new philosophy and scientific experiment. For instance, Galileo also, in his very famous book, Il Saggiatore, which was published in 1623, he points out that the book of nature is composed in the language of mathematics, departing from the organic, teleological, absolutist concept of the universe. He wanted to interpret the ordered universe by means of reason, mathematics, and mechanical study of matter. And this mathematization of natural phenomena culminated in Newton's Principia, published 1687, and Optics, 1704. A similar explanatory model of nature was formulated by Descartes, the French philosopher, in his very famous book, Traité du monde et de la lumière, The Light of the World, in which it explains the physics of light and motion. This is how we find that there was a rejection. There was a rejection of the absolutist sense of order, the idea of the Concordia discourse, so wonderfully held by the Elizabethans. But here is the first time that we find that nature comes to be, analyzed and observed in terms of experimentations, different kinds of experimentations. I'm not going into those details because that will take much of my time. But at the same time, this is the period which created a new intellectual climate, a very new intellectual climate. I can refer to the Czech scholar Comenius, who visited the city of London in 1641. He was talking about the prevalent situation in London. He praised the cultivated society, the rise of the reading public, and the intellectual climate of England. And it has been pointed out by critics that Comenius's plan to establish a universal college. Comenius actually wrote a book called Via Lucis, The Way of Light, where he wanted to establish a universal college. And this perhaps led to the formation of the famous Royal Society of London. The reading public, constituted of heterogeneous categories, began to grow extensively. And different critics have discussed the nature of the reading public in different ways, but I'm not going into those details. I'm just talking about, I'm just referring to some of the intellectual circles which are very famous. For instance, the tribe of Ben, that means the people surrounding Ben Jonson. And then, now forgotten, a famous man, Sir Henry Wotton, his circle, the circle of Sir Henry Wotton, the circle of the Middle Temple, and the circle of the Great Two Circle. This was called the Lawyers' Circle, which actually began to discuss various philosophical, religious, intellectual debates of the time. So it is in this way we find the emergence of the cultivated middle class leadership. It is in this way that we actually come to almost the end of the first phase. I'm not going into all the details, but I will now just refer to some of the important points. Actually, I would refer to two very important conceptual aspects. Number one is nature, and number two is weed. Now, what is nature? Previously, in the Elizabethan system of thought, nature is considered to be a Concordia discourse. Everything may have a plenitude, a variety, but all is one. It is unum pluribus. It is one in many. the many into one. That was the system. But in the scientific order, which is gradually emerging in the 17th century and which Milton is experiencing, shows that nature is a perfect order. That's why in the 17th century philosophical thought, at the macrocosmic level, a similar perfection, which is embodied by nature as order. Nature here means, you must remember that nature doesn't refer to the plants and the trees and the lakes and the rivers. No. Nature is a highly loaded philosophical term, as it is in the 16th century, so also in the 17th, as also in the 18th century. So nature actually is a preconceived sense of order. That's why the 17th century philosophers think that at the macrocosmic level, a sense of perfection is immanent in the planetary systems, the movement of the planets, the cycle of seasons, or the cycle of day and night. If you have read Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 4, there you will see that Eve is asking Adam about the planets, the stars. Why are there these stars and the planets giving us light? Why is there the moon? He is asking these questions to Adam. Adam says that is the perfection. That is the macrocosmic perfection, he means. That is the sense of perfection. They move according to an order. And we have also to imitate that sense of order in order to be perfect. So nature is perfection. Nature is harmony. Nature is balance. Nature is order. And this is at the macrocosmic level. At the microcosmic level, the world of human reality should also try to be compatible with that sense of order and perfection. So it is in this way that I will just I'll just cut down some of my points. In fact, very briefly, I must say that the Elizabethan school of criticism had been very, very much Italianate, but the 17th century philosophical system is basically adherent to the French critical tradition. And this is very definitely found in the French critics who began to exert a great influence on the 17th century writers, including Milton. For instance, Boileau wrote his book, L'Art Poétique, The Art of Poetics. Le Bossu wrote the book, The Poème Épique, The Epic Poem. Raffin, Reflections sur la Poétique d'Aristotle, meaning the reflections on the poetics of Aristotle. Then Cornell, examination, discourse, etc. The 17th century literary theory came to be largely influenced by similar critical and ideals, enshrined also in a specific Dutch critical theorist called Daniel Heinsius. We must remember this man. He actually had a very great influence on the 17th century writers, especially in the domain of dramatic craftsmanship. His book, De Tragica Constitutione, which means the craft of tragedy, it was published in 1611, and it exerted a great influence on the 17th century writers. So after this brief view, I can talk about this for hours, but I'll have to also talk about another very critical, important critical dictum, which is wit or ingenue. Wit is regarded as objective speech. Let me quote some lines from Dryden. Dryden writes in his epilogue to Conquest of Granada. It is published in 1672. He celebrates the age of wit. Wit is now arrived to a more high degree. Our native language more refined and free. Our ladies and our men now speak more wit in conversation than those poets read. Even before that, in Advancement of Learning, Bacon also praised the element of wit. It is objective speech. It is intelligent speech. It is the inventio. So it is in this way we find different kinds of, ideals coming up. And now I will skip this discussion. I'll end this discussion because I believe that you have been able to gather some ideas regarding the socio-political reality of the time. You have seen the time of James I, and James I's sense of luxury and entertainment, so to his wives, and that actually created a huge pressure on economy. Economy actually began to decline, and it also brought down a debasement and decline in the decline as compared to the Elizabethan time of dignity and splendor. And then comes Charles I. We find that a keen kind of controversy began to develop between the church and the parliament, between the monarchy and the parliament, and also the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, very repressive kind of role played by William Laud, and also the annoyance generated among the Scots. So as a result of that, he also closed down the parliament for a long time, and then ultimately the rebellion and the revolt and the Puritan government. Then we find that Oliver Cromwell comes to emerge as the Lord Protectorate, and very briefly his son later after him, Richard Cromwell. So it is in this way that we find that it's an age of turbulence. It's an age of turbulence, and very surprisingly, Milton grew up to see all this. But consider the intellectual climate, that's absolutely different. It seems it has as if no relation with such controversies, turbulences, growing up in the country. So this actually creates a kind of tension. How is it that the same people are emerging, are taking part so vehemently in different kinds of rebellions, revolts, all kinds of disturbances, be it religious, be it political, be it social? But at the same time, there are people who are trying to bring about the age of new philosophy, new science, through observation and experiment, starting in the later years of Bacon till, Newton and many others following him. So it is in this way we find that a new conceptualization of nature comes up. Nature is ordered. At the macrocosmic level, consider the planetary system, the movements of the planets. Consider the cycle of day and night. The sun rises and the sun sets, the moon rises and the moon sets at a particular appointed time. So there is order, immanent in nature. And that sense of nature, that sense of order should be put forward in the social system of thought. So you can see that where we find turbulence in the political, and religious layers, we find a different picture when you consider the new philosophy and the new science. The two are extremely opposed to each other. And Milton grew up to see such oppositions. And I will now end that long lecture. Now I come to John Milton. And now, if I look at it, if I look at John Milton, I try to divide his life in 4 distinctive aspects. Number 1, I consider the formative years. I'm not interested in the details, when he was born, where he was born, who were his brothers and sisters, etc. I'm not interested in that. That can be found in any kind of history book. But I'm interested in the formation of the poet, the formation of the writer, and the changes and the transformations in the writer. So in the first place, I talk about the formative years. And then secondly, I talk about the brief Horton period and the Italian journey. And in the third phase, I talk about the political Milton, which completely separates itself from its poetical identity. And finally, I come back to the poetical Milton. So it is in this way that I will try to look at Milton. And let me be very brief, because I find that it is almost an hour. So formative years, it begins with 1608 and ends with 1632. 1608, he was born in London, and his father also was called John Milton, the same name. Now the first, in these formative years, the first influence, I must consider the influences on the poet. The first influence was his father. Gordon Campbell has written a biography of John Milton. Here, he recognizes